este programa de charlas online. Como sabéis, vamos a participar en este programa de charlas con Charlene Carruters, que hablará mañana, y hoy tenemos a Donna Haraway, que entrará aquí. Está en su propia habitación, compartiendo habitación con nosotras, a punto de esperar con Helen Torres. La charla va a ser íntegramente en inglés y más adelante sí que editaremos un vídeo con subtítulos para que podamos difundir las ideas de Donna Haraway que consideramos que son fundamentales para comprender la situación tan extraña, estos tiempos tan raros que nos están tocando vivir. Pues poco más tengo que añadir. Por otro lado, sí que quería decirles que in this ecological devastation, multiespecies feminist theorist Donna Haraway offers provocative new ways to reconfigure our relations to the earth and all its inhabitants. She will talk today, now, with the translator of her latest book, Seguir con el problema, that we published last year, the sociologist and educator and also translator and friend, Helen Torres. They are with us. They are going to talk in a minute. And the last thing I want to tell you is that if you want to make any question, if you want to say, if the public do that you are listening to us, if you want to make any question, you can use the hashtag Haraway consonni, altogether Haraway consonni on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and we will select some of the questions to ask to her just in the end of the conversation. And also, we want to also thank you, obviously, to Donna and to Helen that they want to join us to this conversation. And please, I want to say to everyone that let's not stop buying books from our favorite publishers and bookstores. No dejemos de comprar libros en nuestras editoriales y librerías preferidas. Y si no tenéis este libro, Seguir con el problema, os animamos a que lo adquiráis en todostuslibros.com o en libelista.com para apoyar a las librerías o bien en nuestra propia web. I don't have anything else to say, just I remember the hashtag Haraway consonni just to make any question. We will select the questions and in the end, Helen is gonna make one of these questions to Donna. So that's it. Thank you, Donna and Helen, and it's your turn. Thank you very much.
Okay, so here, okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. And thank you, Donna, for sharing, for your generosity, for sharing your time with us, and thank you for your work, that it has been so inspiring and generative, in ways in my life, and in ways that I couldn't have imagined the first time I read you, And so thank you for all this. And I would like to offer this conversation, not as a list of solutions of what to do or much less what to believe, but as a device to learn how to think better, to learn how to think well, in these times of uncertainty. Okay, so I was yesterday trying to put all my questions together, and there were so many questions, and I also have written to colleagues and people I know from the fields of arts and activism to share also their questions to Donna. And of course, I have so many things to say, but I realized that all of the questions people were asking have a connection between them, and it is how we read your book today. Okay, so this is such a big question that what I'm going to do is to, introduce the questions with the situation in what is going on today, and with a quotation from the book. Okay, and here I bought the book. Okay, in Spanish. The book was here. Okay, which is beautiful. So this is the Spanish version, which was published last year, but the original version, which I also have here, because it's the one I'm going to read the quotations from, it was published in 2016. So exactly. So 2016, Donna, that you wrote the book like at least 5 years ago. So the problem was, of course, the problem that led us to the situation we're now, that it has mutated a lot. Okay, this problem, but especially where I think that it has changed a lot, is how we read the problem. Okay, so let me start with my first question, because I just wanted to, before starting with the question, I want to read a quotation from your book for people who haven't read it. And it's like, it talks to tentacular thinking. I want to read this for people to have an idea of what you said like more than 5 years ago and how we read it today, okay? And the quotation says, how can we think in time of urgencies without the self-indulgent and self-fulfilling myths of apocalypse, when every fiber of our being is interlaced, even complicit in the webs of processes that must somehow be engaged and repatterned? Okay, so now I read this and I feel really touched, because it's like very intense. So my first question has to do with something that you said in the introduction of the book, and is that you said that the book and the idea of staying with the trouble are especially impatient with two responses that I hear all too frequently to the horrors of the Anthropocene and the capital of sin. The first is easy to describe and I think dismiss, namely economic faith in technofixes, whether secular or religious. The second response, harder to dismiss, is probably even more destructive, namely a position that the game is over. And so these two kind of responses, like the technofix solution and the game over, are everywhere today. Like we have, like the idea of the vaccine is going to be the solution to all our problems. And of course, it's very difficult to dismiss the idea of the game over. Okay. And so the question is, how do we become with the virus? Okay. How do we, because I heard also Vinciane Desprez these days, this encounter such KM, that she said that we have to be diplomatic. We have to be diplomatic with the virus. And all the idea of the book is this idea of becoming with, like it's not technofix, it's not the game over, it's becoming with. You say we become with or we don't become at all. So this is my first question, how we do become with the virus. What do you think about this statement of Vinciane, that we have to be diplomatic with the virus?
Ok. Buenos días y buenas tardes. Y, quiero decir muchas gracias para la traducción, Helen, y para la publicación, María. Necesitamos nuestras librerías. Hoy es muy importante. And then I will switch to English. Well, it is not game over. And we have no techno-fix, but we are living in times of urgency. Did the picture? Okay, my picture failed for a second. There are so many things to say that are so many things to feel and do with each other in pandemic time, in times of intensified, we have an intensified living and intensified consciousness of what has been released in Gaia, what has been released in the ways in which the earth has been damaged so that it has become pandemic friendly, so that the rapid spread of mass disease and the intensification of extraction, even in times of mass suffering, such that catastrophe capitalism is doing very well today. Thank you. In fact, there are super profits being made, even as the disease and death is experienced, for example, in the United States, with special severity in communities of color, in indigenous lands. For example, the Navajo Nation has the highest rate of illness and death In the United States, it's a higher rate of illness and death even than New York City, which is horrific. And within New York City, we all know that the burden is especially borne in the communities of color of New York City, not only, but with special intensity. So that the times in which we are living are times of intensification of what has been the case structurally, affectively, in the world for a long time. And this is a time also when we see people trying to think and act, trying to realize what will come after that is not the same as what came before, trying to think through and enact the kinds of communities, the kinds of movements toward care and justice, the kinds of, for example, rethinking the question of food supply as a question of care and justice that is intensified in pandemic times. It is perfectly clear that essential workers in the food supply in country after country after country are people who are hyper-exploited, often migrant, often illegal, often not owning the land, often not having the proper kind of housing and protection of their own health, often with the worst schools, often not speaking the languages of the dominant culture, that the food supply chains rest on both the organisms, the monocropped plants and the monocropped animals, rest on the non-human and the human in ways that perpetuate food injustice, food deserts in some places, hyper elite food, food castles, in other places. Lots of us in times of pandemic are seriously rethinking how the crisis in food could result in stronger local markets, different kinds of supply chains, attention to legalization and protection of the workers in food, paying attention to the way essential workers are in many ways the most exploited. So it seems to me that in times of pandemic, without apocalypse, and without the idea of techno-fix, it's not that the vaccine is going to fix all of this, but our heightened realization around question of who eats and who is eaten and how, could perhaps result in some major changes, major challenges, both to the conditions of labor and to the sheer existence of industrial animal agriculture and of globalized food chains that result in extremely uneven food insecurity. I think of that as a way of negotiating with the virus, that the virus heightens this, but the virus doesn't cause this situation. And in the time of relative shutdown, in the time of economic crisis, shutdown for some and forced labor for others, this is not a time of sheltering for everybody. In fact, it has been a time of intensified exposure for many, while vast numbers of people are shut down and economies are destroyed. In this intensified situation of urgency, perhaps major kinds of ways of living and dying, for example, the animal industrial food complex, will finally be subject to the kind of political, emotional, community movements toward justice and care that have been needed for a long time, but are especially clear now. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, thank you for the answer, because you answered lots of other questions I had. I was going to ask you, so that's perfect. But now, when you were talking, I thought about two things you said, which are very important in your book. One is the idea of double death, and the idea of temporality. Okay, so let's go first in connecting with what you have just said. This idea of double death from Deborah Rose, which you really use in your book in a very interesting and important way. So I'm going to read a note. The notes of the book are amazing. And this is a note to chapter 5, which is Sowing Worlds, one of my favorite chapters in the book, is where you have this string figure with Ursula K. Le Guin. Okay, and here you have this quote from Deborah Rose from Report from a Wild Country. And you said, Rose taught me that recuperation, not reconciliation or restoration, is what is needed to make it possible. I find many of the words that begin with re useful, including resurgence and resilience. Post is more of a problem. So would you like to expand on this idea of double death and how we live this day?
Deborah Bird Rose, who died recently and is a major loss from our community, was an anthropologist who worked in Australia. And from her teachers, her Aboriginal teachers in northern and north central Australia, she, in English, proposed the idea of double death. That she felt she had learned from study with her teachers, her mentors. The double death is about the killing of ongoingness, living and dying in flourishing, in mortal and finite ways, taking care of country, taking care of land, taking care of generations in living and dying together is good. Double death is not living and dying. It's not about dying or even killing. It's about the killing of ongoingness, the killing of the conditions of going on, the killing of the heart, the killing of the land, the obliteration of species, the obliteration of ways of living and dying together. Double death is the killing of ongoingness, the killing of the possibility of carrying on. So mass extinction, genocide, ecological destruction, those are all examples of double death. I think that what all of us face now is learning to undo the threads of double death and to reconstitute, to rehabilitate, to make live again through partial healing the ways of living and dying that deserve a present and deserve a future. So there will be no going back to prior conditions. There will be no complete recuperation, some complete restoration, or even reconciliation after, not just after, but in the midst of ongoing genocide. But we need to reconstitute our conditions of going on with each other, with an acute consciousness of what we have inherited, of the historical strengths and devastations, both, that we have inherited. And I think of Deborah Bird Rose as one of the people who has taught me the most from her own work. I think of Leslie Green in South Africa. I think of Kim Tallbear in Edmonton, so on and so forth. I think of all of these people who are deeply engaged with real places, with both Indigenous and other kinds of people who live in place for the possibility of flourishing.
You said, there's something you said in the book that I really love, and it's like, nobody lives alone. You know, everybody is connected to something, but not anything is connected to everything. And that everybody lives in one place, not everywhere.
Exactly. Nobody is every place, and nobody is responsible for doing everything, but we are responsible for doing what we can, and we are responsible from being in place, building out the loops, building out with others the loops and connections, and hyperspaces, this wonderful little crocheted fabulous critter that was made by Vonda McIntyre, science fiction writer and crocheter who contributed to the Crochet Coral Reef, which is a marvelous figuration and instantiation of being in place with others and looping out, making connections, making the kinds of connections that are our cosmopolitanism. So it's not a cosmopolitanism from above, but it's a kind of cosmopolitanism from being in place and making place with each other and connecting. So it's not a question of being restricted to the local, kind of being hedged in by walls. but it's a question of looping and throwing out and catching the loops thrown out by others, so as to tie together what needs to be tied together in order to live well as earthly beings.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is like I think that these things very difficult, like these connections, being isolated with this lockdown. It's like I found it like I know that virtuality cannot replace at all corporality, but it doesn't mean that it disappears. But I think we have to learn how to connect differently. Okay, and I think that one of the ways we can do is what you do with stories, with your storytelling, because all the book and all the storytelling you practice is connecting ideas. I mean, you're connecting the stories, the different stories. They're not isolated stories, but you look for, you highlight the connection between the stories. For example, the last chapter in the book, which is Camille's stories, which is you finish this book, which is kind of, we could say it's an academic book. It has the format of an academic book, but you end the book with a story, with a speculative fabulation story, which is really risky, and I adore that. Okay, so you want to talk? Do you want to tell something about this story, Camille's stories? If you want to, I can read a little bit for people who haven't read it. Okay, Camille's stories. Okay, this is chapter 8. And Donna says, the children of campus, because Camille is a part of this community of the campus, and said the children of campus insist that we need to write stories and live lives for flourishing and for abundance, especially in the teeth of rampaging destruction and impoverization. Okay, so what can you tell us about these Camille stories, and how can these Camille stories help us to think with or to think better?
So let's see if I can get this here.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
This is the frontispiece for the Camille stories. This is a wood sculpture made in the early 20th century in Mexico. It is in a museum in Vancouver. It's not clear who made it or exactly how this wood sculpture came to the museum in Vancouver, but for me, it is a really powerful way of thinking about the ties of the earth, the ties of human beings with each other, the ties of the human and the more than human, the human and the non-human, in times of great precarity and vulnerability. So that the Camille stories are my first effort at writing a speculative fiction, a science fiction. And it grew out of a narration spéculative workshop in France. And I was in a little afternoon session with Vincent Desprez and Fabrizio Terranova. And the organizers of the workshop had set up our little narration spéculative exercise by giving every little writing group a baby. And saying, you now have a baby in your hands and you are responsible to this baby. And somehow you have to get this baby through 5 generations, 5 human generations. This baby and this baby's, the generations somehow have to persist for 5 generations. So do something in your story. So Vincent and Fabrizio and I decided that our baby was neither male nor female, but had the name Camille, which is gender fluid, and that we developed a world, a science fiction world, a speculative, fabulative world, in which communities came together across the earth or were resurgent already in place on the earth for a heightened kind of care through these periods of great danger, in particular in relation to the disappearance of ways of life, the disappearance of peoples, the disappearance of other critters. In the community of Camille, it's set up in a coal mining area in West Virginia that had been devastated by mountaintop coal removal. This community comes together. And one of the purposes of the communities of compost is over a period of a few hundred years to bring the numbers of human beings on the earth from the roughly 11 billion they will be at the end of this century, gradually down to some other number that is more in keeping with balancing the human and the non-human on this earth, but to do it with reproductive and environmental justice. The concepts developed particularly by women of color, Sister Song, and others, through the practices of environmental and reproductive feminist and anti-racist justice as the means and not just the goal, so that the rebalancing of the earth is done through practices of multi-species environmental and reproductive justice. So that in the Camille communities, every new baby has at least 3 parents. And the person who carries the baby has a particular responsibility, which is to identify another species that is in danger of disappearing over the 5 generations unless the communities take special responsibility. So that the baby born as Camille is bonded to monarch butterflies at birth, including genetically bonded, so that the human beings are genetically altered, not the butterflies. And the job of the human beings is to bond with other people and other critters across the life range of the monarch butterflies, that the monarchs might have a future reaching 5 generations. So the Camille's inherit this responsibility from each other from generation to generation. And in the 2nd generation, Camille spends a great deal of time in Michoacan and Mexico, in the areas where the monarch butterflies that fly across the great eastern flyway that reaches from Mexico up through Central America, up through the Gulf area and across the eastern United States and into Canada, that great swath of butterflies that migrate north and south through winter and summer, and which overwinter in Mexico. Camille is part of the cosmopolitanism of the Camilles, which is to make connections with the people, with the farmers, with the foresters, with the campesinos, with the indigenous peoples, with so forth, across the lifeways of the butterfly, to make flourish the human and the non-human together. So Camille is taken in hand by the Zapatista women in defense of land and water, and first learns about trans-basin water transfers, whereby the waters of the water-rich areas of Michoacan are transported to Mexico City, even while the farms and the peoples of Michoacan are water poor. Their lands are converted, their subsistence areas are converted into avocados for international export, a money crop that leaves people even more food vulnerable, perhaps a little more money, but in an international global food chain tied together by green gold or avocados. Camille learns, in other words, the whole apparatus of transformation of life ways, which, among other things, endanger the monarch butterflies, but not just the monarch butterflies, whole ways of life. And Camille's alliances then are to work with and for the human and the non-human, the Oyamel fir trees, the peoples of the butterfly reserves, the peoples in the intermediate forests that are important for water and for wood, the peoples and the other organisms, with the crops, with the trees, with the to be diplomatic with the avocado trees is a little bit like being diplomatic with the new coronavirus. How to be diplomatic, so that the job of Camille in these communities of compost is to engage in the practices of multi-species justice and care with my doll. Okay, this was given to me on my 50th birthday by Jim Clifford and Judith Asen. Judith teaches in Chiapas every year in Mayan communities, and was particularly aware of the Zapatista movements. And Jim and Judith gave me this doll for my 50th birthday, and she has been one of my animating figures ever since. She's one of the ancestors of Camille. This doll is one of the reasons that Camille traveled to
way before the Camille story. So it is like
long before. But it is a fact that the Zapatista movement today, it was in 2019 that the Zapatista women had an international conference of great power, talking about questions of water and land and justice and community. It's an ongoing present tense movement.
Thank you for the way, well, this summary you make of the Camille story is incredible. And I think that Camille stories is really a story of making kin, okay, which is the subtitle of the book. The subtitle of the book is Making Kin in a Zulu Scene. And I think what you finished the book very coherently with this, like all the ideas and all the concepts and the fears you've been, developing throughout the book. Finally, you put them all in a storytelling that connects all these ideas of making kin and what does really mean making kin, in tabulation also, but it's also in facts, because you use a lot of scientific facts to build this story also, and all the story you tell about the water and so. And what I love of the idea of this making kin, not babies, is how it raises responsibility, or how, as you call it, responsibility, with the benefit of the hyphen, like two words that combine to make something like bigger. And this idea of responsibility and this idea of making kin, that it has to do also with this diplomacy, and it also resonates with me that these days, some people from queer movements or gay activists and people living or dying with AIDS, they highlighted something that we have learned, or we should have learned from what it was called pink pandemic. We have to remember the name, okay? The AIDS pandemic, and it is the difference between contagious and transmission. And the difference matters because it places responsibility not on guilty, not on being guilty, but it places it on care, and which is the way that we were just telling about how this community of the campus, like got together and work with this monarch butterflies, not to save them, but as to make them present, in this ongoingness that you said. Okay, so there's so many things. Okay, I want to go back because we just talked about responsibility. That was another question which I think is very important. I think that got quite clear. And then there's the thing of temporality, which I think temporality is very important, not only in your book, but as the way, as you have already mentioned, the way that we are living, this idea of the future that we have, especially the first 15 days after the confinement, there was this kind of phenomenon that a lot of people started to upload, pictures of themselves when they were young, and then they were like massive, in everywhere in the world. And then there was this friend that say, what's going on? Are we saying goodbye by Facebook, or what is this, And then another one said, well, maybe we can't imagine the future. And so we are looking back into our past. And I say, well, yeah, but I mean, this is an individual past, okay? But it looks as if we can't imagine the future because we lost we lost all our appointments, and our plans, and it was like it looks like if we hadn't alive, and that when I was thinking that all the time, popped out in my mind two words that you repeat in your book, and they were very inspiring, which is the thick present. You all the time talk about the thick present, and you define the Thule scene also. This temporality, which is entangled, and is this what has been, what it is, and it's yet to become. I'm going to read the quotation for people. The question goes for you to expand on this idea of the thick present and how do we read this today. Okay, and so this one is, I have the mess of, okay, yes. This one is the sound worlds, which you say in sound worlds, again. I'm reading a quotation again from the same chapter, sorry. And you say, with Le Guin, I am committed to the finicky, disruptive details of good stories that don't know how to end. Good stories reach into rich pasts to sustain thick presents, to keep the story going for those who come after. So can you talk about this thick present and what kind of stories are these good stories we need in this thick present?
There we go. I think you know that Ursula Le Guin is one of my heroes, and that her paper from now many years ago, the carrier bag theory of fiction, is very important to me. And in that story, she talks about needing to stop telling the prick tale, the tale of the hero with the weapons, the tale, truly the tale of phallic travels and return with the bounty. That enough with the prick tale. We need to tell the stories with the finicky details of the living and dying together, the tales of collecting and sharing and taking and giving, which are not innocent stories at all, but they're the stories of living and dying as a net bag, as a mochila, as a kind of collection. Okay. And that these are the stories that Le Guin thinks of as the shape of fiction. So it's not the matrix space with the privileged signifier moving across it, but it's rather something more like this, or something more like this. Can you see that? Whoops, wait a minute. There we go. Wait a minute. There we go. Okay. This is a carrier bag that was given to me by Tania Perez in Bogota last summer when I visited. It's made by a collective of women who are working in defense of land and water and reproductive health and against sexual violence. It's a story of both campesina and indigenous women who work with fiber crafts. This one, of course, is, you can see this, it's a uterus. It puns on florecer, florecer and flower bee. I mean, the pun is obvious, though it took me a while to get it. This is a carrier bag in Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction. And inside this bag, when you receive it, is the histories of the people who are taking action for their lives now in the context of their histories, their human and more than human histories. It is a thick present. It is a present that brings up the surging past. The past is present, in the present for the ongoing, what is yet to be, what is still possible. It's a story of living thickly with each other in a kind of rich relationship to those who have come before, so as to pass on to those who come after something less violent, which is again from Deborah Bird Rose's way. That's what she learned about temporality, that the present is that time of the cultivation of the capacity to respond, responsibility. It's not a list of rules, it's not responsibilities as a preset ethical or political list, but the cultivation with each other of the capacity to respond, such that we are accountable to those who came before, so as to make what the world, for those who come after, more full of the practices of justice and care. And that's what I mean by a thick present. And it's the kind of storytelling that Le Guin practices, but so do many others. I think of that our storytelling practices are full of ways of imagining and enacting worlds that make more sense.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Now that you were talking about Ursula Le Guin, I would like to read a quotation on your book, because you use a lot of indigenous thinking, indigenous thinking and practice as a real possibility for regeneration and resurgence. Okay, and you talk a lot of stories, indigenous stories, like the story of Black Mesa in Navajo Hopi lands, in the Inupiaq world game, Never Alone, you know, and you said something that I love, which is this idea of Navajo weaving as a cosmological performance, which is also a way for me of how to keep the story going, how to tell stories, because this idea of weaving is also a storytelling. It's a practice of storytelling. And so I want to read this this quotation, which is in chapter 3, which is symbiosis. And so you said, Navajo weaving weaving is practiced all over the Navajo Nation, but I will emphasize the weavers of Black Mesa, their chief, and their alliances. It would be a serious category mistake to call Navajo weaving art, science, activism, which was a comfortable enough name for the crochet coral reef. Besides, by passing robust and precise deniements, both the categories art and science continue to do colonizing work in this context. However, it would also be a serious category error to fence Navajo weaving off from ongoing mathematical, cosmological, and creative practice that never fit ongoing colonial definitions of traditional. Okay.
So, I thought it was the decision to write about Diné Bekeya, Dineta, Navajo Nation, Navajo weaving, Black Mesa was a difficult decision for a lot of reasons. The kind of speaking for Indigenous peoples by white people, including white women, is enough already. The kind of ease with which a person, Jennifer Denetale has been especially eloquent on this matter, an important Diné historian and, active, really important person who has been particularly eloquent about the importance of, in this case, Diné people speaking for themselves, thank you, including in scholarship. In writing that section, I worked as hard as I could to read and listen to and be informed by not just white academic, or for that matter, not just academic scholarship in the usual ways, especially by white people, but not only, but to try to carefully listen to and think with Navajo thinkers in an anti-colonial way, which is essentially impossible. That this is not an innocent practice. Okay, I'm a person who owns Navajo rugs. Right? My husband's father bought a Navajo rug on the reservation many, many years ago. So forth, so on. The lineage of conquest, colonial capitalism in the Southwest is the lineage of, I'm from Colorado. It's my own personal lineage in a range of ways. So the thinking with the Navajo weaving on Black Mesa in relationship to the draining of the aquifer to produce water, to transport the coal slurry from Black Mesa to the generating plant that produces the power to move water over, to do trans-basin water transfer, to water the cities, Phoenix, to water the cities of the Southwest. The extraction of coal and water from both Hopi and Navajo land, where the peoples themselves see their water table sinking, their sheep dying, their people displaced, the prices for their weaving from the 19th century on being essentially prices that kept people in permanent debt. I know, for example, that Navajo rugs that are sold today for many, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars on the international art market, some of the really old work was itself sold by the pound as if it were raw wool in the trading posts on the Navajo Nation, as people are buying sugar and flour and kept in a kind of permanent debt So I know something about the structure of colonial conquest and extraction and the structure of the struggle for indigenous sovereignty that is built into every one of those rugs. And I know a little bit about the way the patterns of those rugs, which, by the way, cannot be protected by, they don't have copyright protection in the way some other indigenous products do have copyright protection. They don't have copyright protection because they were already on the international commodity market by the late 19th century as tourist and commodity goods. So that the efforts to protect the patterns, the way that white traders, scholars, activists, so on, can move into and extract ideas, patterns, stories. There's a tremendous controversy right now about a series of books, science fiction books, that make use of some of the Navajo stories that are not in that should not be in the public domain, but are in the public domain because they were published. I am aware that even writing this section of the chapter located me in the midst of multiple contradictions, and that there was no way to do that and be innocent. But I thought that the practice of solidarity was important enough to take the risk of foregrounding what it would mean to cultivate the capacity to respond in this situation, and that these practices of weaving, which would be a mistake to, as I said in the quote, relegate to the category of craft fiber art. On the other hand, these are practices where families take great pride in their weaving, in their patterns, where individual women are known as weavers. In the Navajo Nation, some men, mostly women, wear the sheep, the weaving. All of it is a matter of great importance, and where the selling of these rugs is really important for the income into the Navajo Nation. So, what constitutes fair price? What constitutes a kind of relationship to these weavings and the people who weave that is counter to colonial capitalism as opposed to yet one more chapter of it? And I'm not sure if my chapter is one more chapter of colonial extractive capitalism, or if it is a partial, a gesture of partial reconciliation. It seems to me that that's the risk of that chapter.
Well, I read the chapter because I'm very worried about this thing because, I'm Argentinian and I live in Europe, but I'm a white person. And so I'm a anti-racist and I'm part of this movement of anti-racist people, but always a bit in the background, because some people say, well, but you're not white. Yeah, I am white, and not also that, but my ancestors were colonizers, and not only that, but I'm living in Europe. So I love the way that you write these stories here, because what I think you're doing is just thinking with, because it's very clear that you're very worried on how, for example, the way you not translate the word "hoso," or I don't know how to pronounce it, word that. This idea of the like a balance in the world, and this also this idea that like harmony, it has been bad translated, you say, as harmony or order. This idea of cannot translate something and that you resist to translate it. I think that is like also a gesture to say, okay, I'm thinking with, because we need it. I mean, I think that they don't need white people, of course. But the earth needs this knowledge and this practice and this thinking, and with people like you or people like me, that we have access to talk to a lot of other people, thinkers, artists, and a lot of transformative forces. So we need this conversation. We need to engage in this conversation. And it's for me, it's similar to what you do with the Make Kill Not Babies. It's very risky what you said, because a lot of not only women, like and also people from the anti-racist movement. It's like, hey, what is this white lady saying? You know, like. Okay, so I'm very sorry because I could be like here for hours, but they're just saying us that they want. There are a lot of questions from people. They say that more than 500 people connected, and they all say that you're awesome. And then I have, okay, I go for the first one. Okay, I'm going to read it as I can. It says Carlos Hoffman. Does the idea of staying with the trouble refer to the unending struggle of biological life as a meaningful lesson for contemporary humanity?
Biological life is relentlessly opportunistic. It's not so much a struggle as a kind of relentless opportunism, full of all sorts of things, including joy and suffering and killing and eating and nurturing and furthering. And the biological world, of which we are full members, it's not like humanity learns from the biological world, but that humanity is within what Bruno would call the terrestrial, Bruno Latour, which we spoke last weekend, that we are earthly. And I'm a biologist by training, and I keep up with biological work, particularly in relationship to theories of the holobiont, theories of living and becoming with each other from the get-go, that the biological world is and always has been a kind of becoming with, and that we have never been one. We have never been individuals. So yes, I think I use biology as metaphor and as story for emphasizing being with, becoming with, rather than becoming with, that we are always already with others in our specificity, in our situatedness, that we are not all the same. Human beings are not the same as octopuses. We are not the same as baboons. We are not the same as ants or as coronavirus, but we are with each other on this earth in ways that matter to ongoingness. So I'm really interested in situated specificity, and I think biology is a really good place to learn situated specificity, because if you're going to take biology seriously, you have to understand what these molecules are doing with these molecules in this kind of world of action and association. It's not all the time everywhere. Specificity really matters if you're a serious biologist. And I think that my sense of staying with the trouble, when I said staying with the trouble, I was more thinking about the troubles, the urgent crises among us. And I don't think of the biological world inherently as an urgent crisis. On the other hand, the radical destruction of complex lifeways, the radical simplification of whole ecosystems, the wiping out of all kinds of diversity, human and more than human, in systems of monocropping of all kinds, in systems of simplification for extraction. That is a trouble within the biological world, including humanity's place in the biological world. But I really don't think of the biological and trouble well, you see what I mean.
Okay, thank you. Well, I got to the second question here by YouTube, Chiara Garbelotto. Could you say something about the difference between justice and care?
Yeah, you heard me constantly say justice and care, that I wasn't happy with just using one of the two words because they carry different resonances. And there's a way in which talking about care, which I think includes true caring, includes justice, which is the sense of sharp attention to inequity, to balancing living well, to addressing crimes, really, crimes against the world, crimes against the earth, crimes against humanity, crimes against the indigenous, against laboring peoples, against women, the questions of domestic violence and the murder of women, the way that, for example, that domestic violence has been enhanced by shelter in place. Crimes against women and children have been increased, both psychological and physical, in shelter in place. Because to be confined in the domestic space is to be confined within inherited structures of violence. The notion of justice is really crucial to thinking well about these dilemmas. I think that I need the notion of justice in terms of reaching into and addressing structures of injustice and violence. I need care as that way of nurturing and helping to flourish and building the conditions of ongoing with joy, that living and dying with joy with each other. It's not that these ideas, I think, need each other, and they foreground, in a way, each contains the other, in that real justice contains care and real care contains justice, but they foreground different aspects of what needs to be done.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Okay, yeah, mute. No, okay. Third question here by YouTube, Jack Brickhill or something. Are there any projects in store for the cameo stories, either by you or other creatures? Are there any other examples of cameo stories you can think of?
Well, it turns out that the Camille stories have been picked up by quite a number of people. In theater, in artworks, in storytelling, in a kind of online fictional high school exchange about the Camille stories. The Camille stories have been picked up in ways that I really like. I don't know if I will write any more Camille stories. In a way, I think of that last chapter more like a storyboard. It's more like an outline of possible stories than the actual storytelling. I'm not very good at writing fiction myself, though I can write a storyboard. We'll see.
You said in the book that you were going to Rustin, you were going to build a web page.
We did say that, and then we didn't. It might still happen, but we haven't done it, and it's been 5 years, so it doesn't look good.
Doesn't look okay. That's nice because you're just open. What I love of Camille stories is like it's a very open story. Okay, it calls for collaboration of other people. I myself conducted some workshops on Camille stories, and what we did is we took some little pieces of the story and we developed, and it was really funny because what we got were not other stories. We couldn't even write the stories that we imagined, but the whole day of the workshop and talking about it and building like it was very performative, more than writing. Really.
Yeah, okay, I think that
No, it's all.
I think narration spéculative, that kind of relaying of stories, the kind of cat's cradle, kind of string figuring of stories with each other, that's what the Camille stories are about.
Exactly, totally, exactly. Okay, now fourth question. Okay, fourth question, acaba de llegar. Do you think that a nomadic ethic can be useful to think about the Anthropocene crisis?
Well, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is my love of Rosi Bredati and her feminist, working of nomadic ways of being and thinking, and her way of using these ideas to explore the migratory earth, the questions of movement that tie together the beings of the earth, the peoples and the lands of the earth, and then the opposition to a kind of fixity, to the kind of substantialism and human exceptionalism. I think of Rosi Bredati as my friend for life, as both a thinker and a human being, and everything she says I like. I was Tanya's name, my friend in Bogota, Tanya Perez Bustos. I didn't say her name correctly. And she's the one who teaches me overwhelmingly about thinking in fiber practice. She and Lucy Suchman too, and in science studies. And Rosie is in science studies too. These are networks. Yes, this is important to our thinking in this time of the Anthropocene, this time of the ways situated human beings endanger life worlds of the earth, called at the Anthropocene. Not mankind as such, but situated human beings.
Yeah, nothing about it. This men stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we go with a question from Jara Rocha. Hello, Jara. And so she says, I would like to ask something in relation to hyperbolic spaces, as in the mirror and a half society of the so-called new normal, wickedness of Euclidean surfaces is resurfacing with a vengeance. What implications would it have to claim for non-Euclidean surfaces for this thick presence of much more complex societies than the told by the 1.5 meter tail?
I don't think I know the 1.5 meter tail, and I should. So maybe she can fill me in a little bit about that. But the hyperbolic surfaces in the crochet coral reef, which is my way of learning about hyperbolic surfaces, and which is precisely mathematical, thank you. And both Christine and Margaret Wertheim is a mathematician. And Christine Wertheim is a person in literature and an artist, and they're twins. They're from Brisbane. They've worked together for years. The Crochet Coral Reef is a project of now many years in many countries and many languages and many communities of practice that actually craft hyperbolic surfaces as a practice of bringing into consciousness responsibility for endangered coral reefs and their human and non-human peoples of the coral reefs. But the world is hyperbolic, not Euclidean, or the world is probably more than hyperbolic. Hyperbolic surfaces and hyperbolic spaces and this kind of looping out is only one mathematical practices among many. And mathematical practices are tools. They are signifying tools for exploring certain aspects of the world. They are thinking practices. And as thinking practices, they're highly material. You can't substitute this for the world any more than you can substitute the parabola or the square or the circle or Euclidean space. These are all tools for thinking, and none of them is adequate. We make a terrible mistake when we think of any of these tools as somehow an adequate representation of the world, but they can help us explore. They can open up imagination and practice with each other for telling stories and living stories otherwise. And stories are not just fiction, they're the actual ways that we carry on with each other, I think.
I think that this is last question, yeah? Okay, so this is Miguel Aparicio. He says that he's writing from the Brazilian Amazon, downly attacked by the virus in a region without sanitary structures, and by Bolsonaro, first minister of the environment, said recently that we must take advantage to gain ground over the forest while we're absent-minded with COVID-19. Is it possible to make an alliance with the virus against fascism in this dramatic context? We cannot survive with fascism. Can we survive with infection?
Yes, we can survive with infection, but we cannot survive fascism. I do think that the fascism, which is surging in Brazil, in the United States, in Hungary, and many places, the fascism surging on the earth now in powerful nation states endangers our presence and our futures, partly because of the degree of damage already in place. That the resurgent fascism, which includes frank genocide, I think Bolsonaro is engaged in frank genocide, using the virus really as cover, for the push for a final destruction of the Brazilian Amazon, its peoples and its lifeways, human and more than human. And in the United States, I think that the cover of the virus, the cover of the pandemic, ongoing deregulating environmental regulations, ongoing releasing of yet more fossil fuel extraction, mining, so forth. I do think that fascist nationalist governments, which are misogynist, racist, and frankly fascist, are using the pandemic to further their larger and pre-existing ends. Can we live with infection? Well, of course we live. That infection is part of the biological world, including infection that kills differentially, and I think that the strengthening of public health apparatuses so as to protect human beings and the more than human world too, the kind of public health apparatuses that block infections into vulnerable animal and plant populations. For example, the contemporary globalized landscape industry is a pandemic-friendly industry for destroying plants and animals in all sorts of places in the world. It's an instrument of destruction, the contemporary landscape industry that works through infection. So the need for, if you will, a kind of public health apparatus around landscape design, a public health apparatus around what constitutes really protecting the peoples in places of work, in places of care for the elderly, in hospitals, in neighborhoods. Yeah, we can live with infection, which is not the same thing as doing nothing about infection and just embracing the virus. Nonsense. The virus is a killer. But a kind of re-nurturing of biological complexity and habitats, agricultural habitats, forest habitats. These viruses, more and more pandemics emerge and do mass killing, both of humans and more than humans, because of the ongoing destructive practices of hyperbolic global capitalism, which is really hyperbolic.
Really hyperbolic, totally. The master of hyperbolic.
Euclidean. Yeah.
Okay. So I would like to go on. Yeah, but no, they say that they have more questions, but it is time to finish. So I would like to thank you, Donna, for this amazing conversation. It was really generative, inspiring again, I said. And I would like also to thank you especially to Radical May, people who are organizing this event, and also Consonni, the publisher, feminist publisher in Spanish. And I like to thank them because they keep on working. They keep on working under these very difficult circumstances, and not for the sake of productivity, but just because they want to keep on the story going, and I really appreciate this. And also, of course, thank you, the readers, because without readers, there are no books. And of course, all the 500 people, they say, that have been following us in this conversation. And just remember, everybody, that people from Colonialismos del Sur, from Argentina, they're going to translate the conversation and with the subtitles. So in a few days, maybe 15 days maximum, it will be uploaded with subtitles. And I think that's all. Just a final to finish is we are going to finish the conversation with a very short piece of wonderful and beautiful Maria Arnaz, who is an artist and singer, and who has inspired herself in your book to make a short piece. I'm going to finish the conversation with one of her songs. Okay.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Maria. And Barcelona. It's good to be in Barcelona again.
I hope so. Okay, so bye everybody, and thank you. Remember to buy the book, your favorite, and your favorite library. Yeah, or you have also the ebook, and support small libraries and small publishers, because it's important.
It's important.
Okay, very important. Okay, so thank you and goodbye to everybody.
conceptualizan conceptos, importa qué mundos hacen reales otros mundos, importa qué pensamientos piensan pensamientos, importa qué pensamientos piensan pensamientos.